The moment Abigail Prescott stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she knew with cold certainty that the man who had promised to marry her was already dead. She stood in the middle of the main street with her single leather traveling trunk at her feet, and the hot Texas wind pulling loose strands of auburn hair across her face. And she watched the way the townspeople looked at her, that particular mixture of pity and curiosity that people reserve for those who have arrived somewhere they are no longer expected. A woman in a faded blue traveling dress with dust on her hem and hope already dimming in her green eyes. 22 years old, alone, and stranded in a town that meant nothing to her. The letter had caught up with her in San Antonio, forwarded 3 times from her home in Ohio. Thomas Hartley, the man she had agreed to marry through a correspondence arrangement brokered by a respectable agency in Cincinnati, had been thrown from his horse 6 weeks prior and had not survived the fall. She had read the letter twice, folded it precisely, tucked it into her bag, and ridden the remaining leg of the stagecoach journey in silence. There was nothing else to do. She had already sold everything. She had already said her goodbyes. Ohio was no longer a place that held anything for her. Her parents were gone, her sister married and moved to Pennsylvania, and the small boarding house where she had worked as a seamstress had been sold to new owners who had no need of her. So she stood in the street in Dusty Creek and tried to figure out what came next. The town was modest but alive. A general store, a saloon with a painted wooden sign reading the Golden Spur, a post office, a livery stable, a church with a crooked steeple. 2 women in bonnets crossed the street ahead of her and glanced back with that same calculating sympathy. A dog slept in the shade of the porch across the way. The smell of horses and dry earth and something frying in oil drifted through the air. "You need help with that trunk, miss?" She turned. The man standing behind her was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years spent outdoors rather than the artificial tan of someone who simply forgot their hat. He wore a plain brown hat pushed back on his head, a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and boots that had seen considerable mileage. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends, and brown eyes the color of good strong coffee. He looked to be somewhere in his late 20s, perhaps 28 or 29, and he was looking at her with straightforward, uncalculating interest, as though he simply saw a woman with a heavy trunk and a lost expression and wanted to know if he could be useful. "I am all right, thank you," she said, even though she was not all right in any meaningful sense of the word. "You sure?" He glanced at the trunk, then back at her. "That thing looks like it weighs as much as a small calf." Despite everything, she almost smiled. "It might. I packed rather thoroughly." "Benjamin Townsend," he said, extending his hand. She shook it because her mother had raised her to have manners regardless of circumstance. "Abigail Prescott." "You're the woman Thomas Hartley was expecting," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't unkind. It was simply a statement of fact delivered in the quiet, direct way of someone who preferred honesty to dancing around things. "I was," she said, "though I arrived somewhat after the situation changed." He nodded slowly, studying her with an expression that held neither judgment nor excessive sympathy. "You have somewhere to stay tonight." "I intend to inquire at the hotel," she said, though she had precisely $11.40 in her purse, which was unlikely to sustain her for very long. "Mrs. Calloway's boarding house is better value than the hotel," he said. "2 doors past the general store on the left side. She's fair and she keeps a clean house." He reached down and lifted her trunk with what appeared to be minimal effort. "I'll carry this for you. I was heading that direction anyway." She wanted to decline again on principle, because she had learned that accepting help too readily in unfamiliar places could create obligations that were difficult to exit gracefully. But the trunk was heavy, and the street was long, and she was tired in the deep-bone way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of having your future dissolve without warning. "Thank you, Mr. Townsend," she said. They walked together down the main street of Dusty Creek. The woman who had arrived to begin a life and the man who happened to be there when she got off the stagecoach, and neither of them knew yet that this particular coincidence was going to change everything about the next 50 years of their lives. Mrs. Calloway was a compact woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair pinned severely back and eyes that were sharp but not cruel. She sized up Abigail in 3 seconds and apparently found the assessment satisfactory, because she quoted a room rate that was genuinely reasonable and showed her upstairs without excessive conversation, which Abigail appreciated enormously. Benjamin Townsend set the trunk just inside the front door, tipped his hat, and was gone before she had the chance to thank him properly. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in her rented room and looked at the wall and counted her money again, as though counting it a second time might produce a different result. $11.40, perhaps 3 weeks of room and board if she was careful. After that, she would need income. She was an excellent seamstress. She could cook. She could read and write better than most, having been educated at her father's insistence to a level unusual for a woman of her class in Ohio in the 1860s. She could keep accounts. She would find something. She had never in her life waited passively for things to resolve themselves, and she was not going to start now. The next morning she went to the general store. The man behind the counter was named Harold Greer, a heavy-set man with a kind face and ink stains on his fingers. She introduced herself, explained her situation with no more detail than was necessary, and asked whether he knew of anyone in town who required sewing work, household help, or clerical assistance. He scratched his chin, thought about it, and told her that Mrs. Porter over on Elm Street had been complaining about needing help with alterations since her eyesight began failing her, and that the schoolhouse was in need of a part-time assistant since the teacher, Miss Bean, had sprained her wrist quite badly and was struggling with the younger students. Abigail thanked him, made note of both possibilities, and spent the rest of the morning knocking on doors. By noon she had an arrangement with Mrs. Porter for 3 days a week of sewing and alterations. By 2 in the afternoon she had spoken to Miss Bean, a thin, energetic woman of about 35 with a wrapped wrist, and a classroom of 11 students ranging in age from 5 to 14, and had agreed to come in every morning for 2 hours to help manage the younger children while Miss Bean focused on the older ones. It wasn't luxury, but it was income, and income was a foundation. She was walking back toward the boarding house feeling considerably lighter than she had the evening before when she nearly collided with Benjamin Townsend in front of the livery stable. "Miss Prescott," he said, catching her by the elbow to steady her, then releasing her immediately, "you look less worried than yesterday." "I found work," she said. "2 positions, actually." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of quiet satisfaction, as though he had suspected she would manage and was pleased to be right. "That was fast." "I don't believe in waiting for problems to solve themselves," she said. "No," he agreed, studying her in that straightforward way she was beginning to recognize as simply being how he looked at things that interested him. "I wouldn't imagine you do." She found herself curious about him in turn, despite herself. "What is it you do, Mr. Townsend?" "Are you a rancher?" "I have a small cattle operation about 4 miles east of town," he said. "Not large, about 240 head currently, but I've been building it for 6 years, and it's mine free and clear, which matters more to me than the size of it." "That seems like sensible thinking," she said. "I'm a sensible man," he said, and there was the faintest hint of something self-deprecating in it, as though he was aware that being sensible was not generally considered a romantic quality. She laughed. It surprised her, a real laugh, the kind that came up before she could think better of it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know why that struck me as funny." "It's all right," he said, and he was smiling in a way that changed his whole face, deepening the lines at the corners of his eyes and making him look younger and easier all at once. "I've been told sensible is a polite word for dull." "I don't find it dull at all," she said, and she meant it. "In my experience, sensible is considerably undervalued." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the odd sensation of being seen more clearly than she was accustomed to. "May I buy you coffee, Miss Prescott? The diner makes a decent pot and I was heading there." She considered it for exactly 1 second. "Yes," she said, "that would be very nice." The diner was run by a wide-shouldered woman named Vera, who poured coffee with aggressive generosity and asked no questions, which suited both of them. They sat across a small table from each other, and Abigail told him about Ohio and the sewing work and her parents who had both died of influenza when she was 19, which had left her in the somewhat precarious situation that had eventually led her to the correspondence agency and Thomas Hartley. She told it without self-pity, as a simple sequence of events that had produced a specific outcome, and he listened to all of it without interrupting or offering the kind of hollow, sympathetic noises that most people felt obligated to provide. In return, he told her about coming to Texas at 21 with $40 and a borrowed horse, about buying his first small parcel of land with money he had saved from 2 years of working as a ranch hand for a man named Cutter over in the next county, about the year the drought had killed half his herd and he had nearly lost everything, and how he had taken on fence repair work for neighboring ranchers through the winter to keep from going under. About how the land was his now in a way that felt physical, the way hunger felt physical, which was the only comparison he could find that made any sense. He was 29 years old. He had come to Texas from Missouri. He had a dog named Hector who herded cattle with considerably more enthusiasm than skill. He had not laughed like this, and she noted with some surprise that he had laughed 3 times during their conversation, in longer than he could precisely remember. "You are not what I expected," she told him honestly, as Vera refilled their cups for the second time. "What did you expect?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "The first time I saw you I thought you were probably quiet and uncomplicated." "You are quiet, but you are not at all uncomplicated." "I'll take that as a compliment," he said. "It was one," she said, and held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before looking down at her coffee cup. She walked back to the boarding house alone, because it was only a short distance, and the street was busy with afternoon activity, and she sat in her room and thought about the fact that she had laughed more in 2 hours in a Texas diner with a cattle rancher she had met the previous day than she had in the past 2 years of her life in Ohio. She thought about Thomas Hartley, whom she had never actually met, and had only known through letters, kind, careful letters that had told her he was a good man, but had never once made her laugh. She thought about what it meant that she was not grieving him so much as grieving the idea of what he had represented, a solution, a direction, a future that had been mapped. The future was unmapped again. That was terrifying, and she was just barely beginning to acknowledge something else as well. Benjamin Townsend rode into town twice a week for supplies and to handle business at the bank or the feed store, and after the coffee at Vera's diner, it became a natural thing that when they saw each other on those days, they would stop and talk. It started as brief conversations on the street. Then it became coffee again at Vera's. Then one evening in late April, he asked if she would like to attend the community social that the church was organizing for the following Saturday, because the Reverend had informed him that he needed to bring a potato dish, and he was not confident in his ability to produce one without guidance. The social was held in the churchyard, with long tables brought outside and lanterns strung between the posts, and the whole town turning out in their best clothes. Abigail wore her green dress, which was the better of her two, and had spent 20 minutes that morning fixing a small tear in the sleeve that she had been meaning to get to. Benjamin arrived with a dish of roasted potatoes that he admitted under cross-examination she had essentially talked him through the previous afternoon at Vera's, step by step, until he felt confident he could execute it without supervision. The potatoes were very good. Several people complimented them. He accepted the compliments with a slightly sheepish expression that she found entirely endearing. They sat together at one of the long tables and ate and talked to the people around them. And later in the evening, there was music from a fiddle player named Old Percy, who was missing two fingers on his left hand but played beautifully anyway, and couples danced in the cleared space between the tables. Benjamin asked her to dance with the same direct simplicity with which he did everything, and she accepted. And when he took her hand and put his other hand at her waist, she was struck with the entirely inconvenient awareness that she was acutely, specifically, physically aware of his proximity in a way that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with something considerably more complicated. He was a good dancer. Not showy, not elaborate, but steady and sure in his movements in the way he seemed to be in everything, leading her through the steps with a quiet confidence that made it easy to follow. They danced twice, and then stood at the edge of the cleared space while others danced, talking low beneath the fiddle music about nothing in particular, and Abigail thought that she could not remember the last time she had felt so simply, uncomplicated happy. Just happy. Standing in the warm Texas evening with fireflies beginning to show in the grass beyond the church yard, and the smell of night-blooming sage in the air, and this man beside her who said what he meant, and meant what he said, and looked at her like she was worth looking at. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself she had been in Dusty Creek for less than 2 months. She told herself that good conversation and easy company did not constitute the foundation of a life. She told herself all of this, and then looked up to find Benjamin looking at her with an expression that was carefully composed but not quite composed enough to hide what was underneath it, and she thought that perhaps she was not being foolish at all. May came in hot and dusty, and Abigail settled into the rhythms of her new life with the efficiency that was her nature. Her mornings at the schoolhouse had become genuinely meaningful. She had a particular gift with the youngest students, a patience and inventiveness with how she explained things that made Miss Bean declare her indispensable and negotiate with the school board to have her formally employed as a teaching assistant through the end of the term. Her afternoons with Mrs. Porter produced steady if modest income, and the older woman had taken a liking to her and introduced her to the other women in town with the particular endorsement of someone whose opinion carried weight. She was building a life. She was making it herself, piece by piece, out of nothing but the skills she had and the stubborn refusal to be defeated by circumstances, and it felt good in a way that surprised her better, she thought, than waiting for Thomas Hartley's version of her future to arrive would have felt. Benjamin came to town on a Tuesday in the middle of May with a problem. His herd manager, a man named Cortez who had been with him for 4 years, had broken his leg in 2 places when a fence post fell badly, and Benjamin was now managing the ranch entirely on his own while also trying to keep up with the business side of things. He told her this over coffee with the matter-of-fact tone he used for most things, but she could see the strain in the set of his jaw and the new tightness around his eyes. "Can you not hire someone temporarily?" she asked. "I can," he said. "I've put the word out, but the right hand is difficult to find quickly. I don't want just anyone around my animals." "No," she agreed. "That makes sense." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I was wondering," he said, "whether you might come out and look at my accounts. I've been keeping them myself and I think they're right, but I'm better with land and animals than I am with columns of figures, and I've been letting them slip the past 2 weeks. She looked at him. "You want me to review your ledgers? You said you kept accounts at the boarding house back in Ohio," he said, "and you've been managing 3 different income streams since you arrived here. I trust your precision more than my own right now." It was a practical request. There was nothing improper in a practical request. She told herself this. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." On the following Saturday afternoon, she rode out to his ranch in the hired rig from the livery stable, because he had offered to come and get her, but she had declined, because she preferred to arrive under her own arrangements. The ranch was exactly as he had described it, modest in size. A clean white-painted house that was small but well-maintained. A barn in good repair, fenced pasture stretching away to the east with the cattle visible as a dark moving mass in the middle distance. There were flowers growing against the front of the house, which she had not expected. Red and orange ones in a rough bed along the porch, a little wild but clearly tended. "Did you plant those?" she asked, gesturing at the flowers as he came to meet her at the gate. He looked at them with the slightly defensive air of a man who is about to admit something he suspects might be judged. "My mother sent me the seeds 3 years ago," he said. "She said a house without flowers wasn't a proper home. I didn't put enough thought into it to stop doing it." "I think it's lovely," she said sincerely, and the defensiveness left his expression. He showed her the house kitchen, small parlor, 2 bedrooms, the second of which he used for storage with the casual confidence of a man who was not trying to impress, but also was not ashamed, and then sat her at the kitchen table with the ranch ledgers and a pot of coffee and let her work. He went outside to deal with the evening feeding, while she went through the accounts with the methodical attention she gave everything she put her mind to. The ledgers were essentially correct, as he had suspected, but there were 2 errors in the tallying and 1 category where he had been entering costs inconsistently, which would have created a discrepancy at the end of the quarter. She corrected them and reorganized the category and added a marginal note explaining the adjustment. When he came back in, smelling of horse and fresh air and something clean like cut grass, she showed him the corrections. He sat beside her at the table and leaned over the ledger to follow her explanation, and he was close enough that she could see the particular way his hair curled behind his ear and was aware of the warmth of him beside her in the fading afternoon light, and she was absolutely not going to think about that. "Thank you," he said, straightening up. "You saved me a headache at quarter end." "It was not very complicated," she said. "You were nearly right to begin with." "Nearly isn't right," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He cooked dinner. It was a simple meal: beans and salt pork and cornbread baked in a cast iron skillet, but it was good, and they ate at the kitchen table with the evening sounds coming through the open window and his dog Hector lying with proprietorial satisfaction under the table between their feet. They talked through dinner about the ranch and the plans he had for expanding the herd slowly over the next 2 years, about the trouble he had been having with the fence along the northeastern pasture, where the ground was soft near a creek bed, about the town and the people in it, and the small dramas of community life. After dinner, they sat on the porch in the long Texas twilight, and the sky turned extraordinary colors through the orange and purple range, and the cattle were settled dark shapes in the middle distance, and Hector lay across their feet with democratic affection, and Abigail thought that she had not felt this particular kind of peace in a very long time. "Abigail," he said, using her given name for the first time without ceremony or announcement, just naturally as though it had always been what he called her. She looked at him. "I want you to know," he said, choosing his words with the care he gave to things that mattered to him, "that I'm aware you didn't come to Texas to become friends with a cattle rancher. You came here with a specific plan, and that plan fell apart through no fault of your own, and I don't want to be something else you have to figure out when you're still finding your footing." She was quiet for a moment. "That is very considerate," she said. "I just mean," he said, and she could see he was working at getting this right, "that I'm in no hurry, and I don't want you to feel I don't want to add to what you're already managing." She turned to look at him fully because he deserved a full look for this. "Benjamin," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like something that belonged there, "I appreciate that enormously, and I want you to know that what I am currently managing is considerably more settled than it was 6 weeks ago. I have income. I have a room I like. I have work that matters to me. I have made acquaintances in this town who are beginning to become friends." She paused. "And I have you, which I find I value considerably more than I would have predicted 2 months ago." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but it made her heart do something inconvenient. "That's good to know," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "I thought it might be." The summer of 1878 in Dusty Creek was dry and blazing, the kind of heat that pushed itself through walls and made the air above the road shimmer in silver waves. Abigail's sewing work increased when 3 women in town decided they wanted new dresses made for the 4th of July celebration, and she found herself spending her evenings bent over fabric by lamplight, with a patience that came partly from genuine skill, and partly from the fact that she enjoyed having something to focus on when her thoughts got the better of her. Her thoughts had been getting the better of her with increasing regularity. Benjamin had started coming into town on Thursdays as well as Tuesdays, citing various practical reasons: a piece of hardware he needed, a letter to post, a question for the bank. And she was aware that these reasons were not entirely the reasons. She was equally aware that she had begun to watch for him on Thursday mornings through the schoolhouse window, which looked out onto the main street in a way she would have been embarrassed to admit to anyone. They had fallen into a rhythm that felt both new and deeply familiar, which she had heard described before but never experienced. Tuesday and Thursday coffee at Vieira's. An occasional Saturday afternoon at the ranch when she had no other obligations, going over accounts or simply sitting on the porch and talking. A walk around the edge of town one evening, when the air finally cooled after dark and the stars came out in their full Texas extravagance, and they walked for an hour and a half discussing everything from the nature of ambition to the best way to repair a crumbling mud brick wall. And then he walked her back to the boarding house and stood at the gate and said goodnight with a formal courtesy that was charming precisely because it was slightly at odds with the easy intimacy of everything that had come before it. He had not kissed her. She was beginning to consider this both respectful and faintly maddening. The 4th of July celebration brought most of the county into Dusty Creek. There was a parade of sorts, local ranchers on their horses, the schoolchildren carrying paper flags that Abigail had helped them make the previous week, the Reverend walking with great dignity at the front. There were pies on the long tables outside the church, and competitions, and a great deal of noise from firecrackers that the children found spectacular, and that made the horses nervous. Abigail wore the green dress again, and felt the particular pleasure of watching children she had been working with for 2 months marching importantly with their paper flags. And when she caught Benjamin's eye from across the street as the parade passed, he smiled at her in a way that traveled from her chest all the way down to her feet. He worked his way through the crowd to her side as the parade ended and stood beside her watching the children disperse, and she was aware of him with that heightened physical consciousness that she had given up trying to talk herself out of. "Those flags were your idea?" he asked. "The children made them," she said. "You know what I mean." "Yes," she admitted. "It was my idea." "They looked very fine," he said. They ate pie together. His was peach and hers was cherry, and talked to the people around them, and watched the children run their races in the afternoon heat. And when the evening came and the lanterns were lit and Percy's fiddle started up again, he asked her to dance before anyone else could, and she thought she detected a certain intentionality in the timing that pleased her. They danced 3 times. On the third dance, which was slower than the others, he pulled her slightly closer than he had before. Not so close as to be improper, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him and the solidness of his hand at her waist. And she looked up at him to find him already looking down at her with that expression she had learned to read over the past months, the particular careful intensity of a man who was thinking about saying something important and deciding whether this was the moment. "Abigail," he said. "Benjamin," she said, because she had learned that sometimes it helped to say a person's name to give them whatever they needed to continue. "I want to take you to supper," he said. "Not coffee at Vieira's, proper supper. The hotel has a dining room and they do a good table on Friday evenings." She studied him. "Are you asking me to supper?" "Yes." "Then ask," she said. He almost smiled. "Would you do me the honor of having supper with me at the hotel on Friday evening, Miss Prescott?" "I would like that very much, Mr. Townsend," she said, and was rewarded with the full version of his smile, which was still capable of surprising her. Supper at the hotel on Friday was the most dressed up either of them had been in the other's presence, and there was a slight comedy in it. She wore her green dress again, because it was her best, and she had spent an hour that afternoon pressing it carefully. And he appeared in a clean white shirt and a dark jacket and his best boots, and looked so genuinely uncomfortable in formal clothes that she had to focus very deliberately on the menu to prevent herself from laughing. "You are doing admirably," she told him over the top of her menu. "I am wearing a collar that is actively trying to kill me," he said. "It's doing no such thing. You didn't choose it." She did laugh then, and he relaxed visibly at the sound of it. And after that the formality of the setting stopped mattering and they were simply themselves again, talking across the white tablecloth by candlelight, while the dining room murmured around them, with the town's more prosperous residents and a few travelers. He ordered steak and she ordered chicken, and they shared a piece of apple pie at the end because the portions were large and splitting them seemed sensible. And over coffee, he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has decided to stop being careful and just do the thing. "I am falling in love with you," he said. He said it plainly, with no dramatization, the way he said everything important as a fact that needed to be stated because it was true and it mattered. The candlelight was gold and warm. The dining room was a soft hum around them. His hands were large and warm over hers on the white tablecloth, and she looked at him across it and thought that she had not been looking for this when she stepped off that stagecoach in May, but that the best things rarely announce themselves in advance. "I know," she said. "I have been watching you fall, I think, for a while." And, he said, with a quiet patience that she had come to understand was one of the things she loved most about him. And she said, "I believe I have been falling rather steadily in the same direction." His hands tightened over hers just slightly. "That's the best thing I've heard in a very long time," he said. "Yes," she said softly, "I imagine it is." He walked her home that evening in the warm dark, and at the gate of the boarding house under the stars, he turned to her and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that made her breath catch. And then he kissed her carefully, softly, with the unhurried attention he gave to everything he truly cared about, and she kissed him back and thought that this was the moment she would think about for the rest of her life. This particular summer night in Texas, with the smell of sage and the stars overhead and everything that had seemed lost revealing itself to have been simply redirected. August brought 2 complications and 1 revelation, and all 3 arrived more or less simultaneously, as things tend to when the summer grows long and the heat makes people impatient. The first complication was a man named Douglas Farrell. Farrell was a land speculator from Dallas who arrived in Dusty Creek with money and ambition and an expansive view of his own entitlement, and who had identified several of the smaller ranches in the area, including Benjamin's, as potential acquisitions for a scheme he was putting together with railroad investors in the north. He was a tall, well-dressed man in his early 40s with the polished manner of someone who had made a profession of charming people into decisions that benefited him more than them, and he came to Benjamin with an offer for the ranch that was framed as generosity, but was, on any honest examination, an insult. Benjamin listened to the offer, thanked Farrell for his time, and declined. Farrell came back twice with revised numbers. Benjamin declined twice more, each time with the same quiet courtesy and total immovability that Abigail had come to recognize as the specific face of his stubbornness, which she found admirable. The second complication arrived in the form of a letter from a cattle buyer in Fort Worth named Weston who wanted to purchase 100 head from Benjamin's herd at a price that was fair and would represent a significant advancement for the ranch's finances, but who needed to arrange transport and logistics within a 3-week window that happened to coincide with a fence repair project that couldn't be deferred and the ongoing absence of Cortez, whose leg was healing but slowly. Benjamin came to her on a Tuesday looking tired in the particular focused way he got when he was holding too many problems at once and trying to organize them into an order of priority. She listened to all of it over coffee, asked 3 clarifying questions and said, "The Weston sale cannot be deferred. Write to him today and confirm the window. For the fence repair, speak to the Garza brothers. They are reliable and their rates are reasonable. I've heard this from Mrs. Porter, whose nephew used them last spring. And regarding Farrell," she said, "he will come back a third time because men like that always do, and the answer should be the same." Benjamin looked at her with that expression she was coming to know as the one reserved for moments when she said something he had been working toward himself, and she had arrived there faster. "You're right about all of it," he said. "I usually am," she said, and this time there was no embarrassment in it, only honesty and a slight smile. "I want to ask you something," he said, setting down his coffee cup with a careful deliberateness. She waited. "I want to ask you to consider," he said, working at the words, "whether you might want to make this permanent, what we are to each other. I am not proposing in the back of a diner over coffee, because you deserve better than that and I know it, but I wanted to ask if the idea was one you could consider before I arrange something proper." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are asking me whether I would consider being asked?" "Yes, Benjamin, yes. You are a remarkably complicated, sensible man," she said. "Is that a yes?" "That," she said firmly, "is a very definite yes to considering being asked." The revelation, which arrived on a Wednesday evening in the form of her own clear-eyed accounting of her feelings, was simply this: she was not in the process of falling in love with Benjamin Townsend. She had, sometime in the past 4 months, without announcing itself, completely and thoroughly fallen. It was done. It was settled. It was as certain as the fact of Texas in August, which was to say entirely undeniable. She went to sleep that Wednesday night feeling more settled about the direction of her future than she had since she was a girl with 2 living parents and no particular reason to worry about what came next. Douglas Farrell came back a third time in the first week of September, and this time he was less polished about it. He came to the ranch rather than into town, which was itself a statement of intent. This was not a business call. This was pressure. Benjamin was out with the herd when Farrell arrived, which meant it was Abigail who answered the knock at the door, because she had come out that afternoon to go over the quarter-end accounts and had been sitting at the kitchen table with the ledgers when she heard the horse on the road. Farrell looked at her with a slight recalibration. He had not expected a woman, and introduced himself with the full charm that he apparently kept in reserve for when it might be useful. He asked for Mr. Townsend. She told him he was not available. He asked if she was the housekeeper. She told him with precise pleasantness that she was a close associate of Mr. Townsend's and that she was happy to relay any message. Farrell decided that a woman in the house meant leverage. "I want to help Mr. Townsend understand," Farrell said, in the tone of a man sharing a confidence, "that the offer on the table is about to change. The railroad investors are moving on a tight schedule, and the opportunity has a very limited life. I'd hate for him to miss out on what could be a very comfortable sum by being stubborn." "That's very considerate of you," Abigail said. "The other ranchers in the area have been sensible about it," Farrell continued. "The Hendersons took an offer last week. The Morrison place signed yesterday. When all the surrounding land has changed hands, Mr. Townsend's remaining property becomes a problem for his neighbors rather than an asset, which could create all sorts of difficulties." He said it pleasantly, but the structure of what he was describing was transparent. "I understand you," she said. "I will tell Mr. Townsend you called." Farrell left, and Abigail sat back down at the kitchen table with the ledgers and a coolly furious clarity. And when Benjamin came in an hour later, she told him everything Farrell had said, word for word, with the accuracy she brought to everything. Benjamin's expression went very quiet in the way that meant he was thinking hard and carefully. "Henderson sold," he said. "That's what Farrell said. Tom Henderson wouldn't sell voluntarily," Benjamin said. "He loves that land." "Then perhaps Mr. Henderson's version of voluntary and Mr. Farrell's version differ somewhat," she said. Benjamin sat down and was quiet for a moment. "I need to speak to the sheriff," he said finally, "and to Henderson directly." "Yes," she agreed. And I think you should write to the land office in Austin, because if Farrell is misrepresenting his arrangement with the railroad to create the impression of inevitability, that is worth examining." Benjamin looked at her. "You have been thinking about this." "It's what I do," she said simply. "I know," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that went beyond the immediate problem. A kind of wonder at her, quiet and genuine, that made her look away for a moment because it was almost too much. The situation with Farrell resolved itself over the following 3 weeks in a way that was less dramatic than the setup suggested, which was how most things resolved themselves in real life when they were handled correctly. Benjamin spoke to Sheriff Hendricks, who turned out to already have questions about Farrell's activities from other property owners in the county. Benjamin spoke to Tom Henderson, who confirmed that the purchase of his property had involved representations about the railroad investment that he had not fully understood when he signed. A letter to the land office in Austin produced an inquiry. Farrell, faced with the prospect of official attention, quietly departed Dusty Creek on a Wednesday morning and was not seen again. Tom Henderson did not get his land back, which was a sadness and an injustice that no amount of official inquiry was going to fully address. The man had signed papers, and signed papers were signed papers, regardless of how those signatures had been obtained through misleading information. Benjamin rode over and spent an afternoon with Henderson, who was 57 and had spent 30 years on that land, and when he came home that evening, he was quieter than usual in a way that had nothing to do with Benjamin himself and everything to do with the difficulty of watching something wrong occur and being unable to fully correct it. Abigail sat with him on the porch that evening and did not try to make it better with words, because there was nothing to say that would make it better. She simply sat beside him and was present, and after a while he took her hand and held it, and they watched the dark come over the pasture together. "Thank you," he said eventually. "I didn't do anything," she said. "Yes, you did," he said. "You stayed." On a Saturday evening in the 3rd week of September, Benjamin Townsend came to the boarding house with his hat in his hands and asked Mrs. Calloway if he might speak with Miss Prescott on the porch. Mrs. Calloway, who was not a romantic woman by any particular disposition but was not blind either, gave him the kind of look that communicated that she was aware of exactly what was happening and approved of it, and went and fetched Abigail. Abigail came out to the porch to find Benjamin standing with his back to her, looking out at the street, in his clean white shirt and his good hat, and she had the sudden sharp awareness that this was the moment she had been waiting for, and that she was absolutely ready for it. He turned when he heard her and looked at her for a moment in the evening light, and she watched something resolve itself in his expression, the last of any uncertainty simply settling and clearing. He did not go down on one knee, which she would later tell people about because it was exactly right for him. He stood there solidly, the way he stood in the world, and said, "Abigail, I want to spend my life with you. I want to build something with you, not just the ranch, but a life, a real one with all the parts. I want to eat breakfast with you and argue about ledger columns and watch the stars from the porch and have children who have your intelligence and whatever patience they can get from me. I want you to be my wife, if you'll have me. I believe I will spend every day of the rest of my life being grateful if you say yes." She stepped forward and took his face in her hands and looked at him steadily. "Benjamin Townsend," she said, "you are the best man I have ever known. Yes, absolutely and without any reservation, yes." He kissed her there on the porch of Mrs. Calloway's boarding house in the September evening, with the whole main street of Dusty Creek available to witness it if anyone cared to look, and she kissed him back with her hand still on his face, and the feeling of rightness so complete and physical that she understood for the first time in her life what people meant when they said a thing was meant to be. Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway behind them and said dryly that she supposed she had better start looking for a new tenant. They were married in November of 1878. The ceremony was held in the small white church in Dusty Creek on a Saturday morning when the Texas sky was the particular deep blue that it turned in fall, and the air had finally lost its summer ferocity and come to something crisp and clean. The Reverend, a thoughtful man named Whitfield who had spent 15 years in Dusty Creek and had seen considerable amounts of human complication pass through his church, performed the ceremony with a simple dignity that suited them both. Miss Bean was Abigail's witness, having become in the 6 months since Abigail's arrival something close to a genuine friend, sharp, funny, opinionated, the kind of woman who said what she thought and expected the same in return, which Abigail found deeply refreshing. She stood to Abigail's left in her best dress with an expression of frank happiness that she made no effort to contain. Cortez, whose leg had healed well enough by October that he had returned to work with a pronounced limp that the doctor said would likely fade over time, stood with Benjamin with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had watched his employer be increasingly distracted for 5 months and was glad to see the source of the distraction formalized. Abigail wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored fabric she had ordered from San Antonio, simple, beautifully cut, with small pearl buttons at the cuffs that she had spent 3 evenings sewing on with the finest thread she owned. Her hair was up with 2 small flowers from her own garden tucked behind her ear. She had started her own flower garden at the boarding house in her last weeks there, because she was her mother's daughter and growing things mattered to her. She carried a small bunch of them. Benjamin looked at her when she came down the aisle of the small church with a directness of feeling that made something catch in her throat, and she walked toward him steadily, because it was the steadiest thing she had ever done in her life. They made their promises to each other in plain words with plain meaning, and when the Reverend pronounced them, husband and wife, and Benjamin kissed her with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything, the whole small congregation of the town of Dusty Creek applauded with the enthusiasm of a community that had watched 2 people find each other and was delighted by the outcome. The celebration afterward was held partly in the churchyard and partly spilling out onto the street, because the whole town came and the churchyard was not really sufficient. There was food from half the women in Dusty Creek, because in small towns the marriage of 2 people is in some sense the marriage of the community to the idea of them, and people bring their best dishes to such events. There was Percy with his fiddle, missing-fingered and incomparable. There was dancing in the street as the afternoon wore on and people had more food and better spirits, and Abigail danced with Benjamin until her feet ached, and then danced some more because there was joy in it that she did not want to stop. Later, when the celebration had moved to the warm lantern-lit final stages, and the children were asleep on blankets in the churchyard, and the older guests had gone home, and only the young and the stubborn remained, Benjamin and Abigail sat on the back steps of the church with cups of cider and the sounds of the remaining celebration drifting out to them, and he put his arm around her, and she put her head on his shoulder, and they sat there in the dark for a long time without needing to say anything at all. "I want to go home," she said eventually. "Our home," he said, and she heard the specific weight he gave it. "Our home," she confirmed. They drove out to the ranch under the November stars, Hector ecstatic in the back of the wagon, and arrived at the small white house with its wild flower bed dormant for winter, and the lamplight in the window that Cortez had left burning for them, and Abigail Townsend, who had been Abigail Prescott when she stepped off a stagecoach 6 months ago with $11.40 and nothing settled, walked through the front door of her home. The first winter of their marriage was the kind that settles into the memory as a unit, not a series of individual days, but a continuous, warm interior thing. The ranch house was small enough that it was easy to heat and to fill with the sound of 2 people living together, learning the specific topography of each other's daily existence. Benjamin woke early before first light and moved through the pre-dawn darkness with a quietness she found remarkable in a man his size, trying not to wake her. She began waking anyway, not from disturbance but from the simple animal awareness of a presence leaving a shared space, and she would lie in the warm dark and listen to him moving in the kitchen and think that this was what it meant to belong somewhere. She continued her work at the schoolhouse through the winter because Miss Bean needed her and because she found the work genuinely satisfying in ways she had not anticipated. The children were her students in all but formal title, and she had formed particular attachments to several of them. A small girl named Rosa, whose parents had come from Mexico 5 years prior, and who was fiercely intelligent and sometimes struggled with the way the other children treated her for it. And a serious boy named Henry who was 11 and wanted to know everything about mathematics with the focused appetite of a child who has found the thing he loves. She discussed them with Benjamin in the evenings, and he listened with real attention, asking questions that revealed he understood that these were not just small stories from her day, but the things that mattered to her, and his interest in them because they mattered to her was one of the ways she kept learning that she had chosen well. He had his own particular satisfactions that winter. The Weston sale had gone through smoothly in October and produced the financial position he had been working toward for 2 years, which allowed him to plan the fence repair along the northeastern pasture properly and to begin the process of expanding the herd. He found a new hand named Willie, 19 years old and earnest and willing, who worked alongside Cortez with an eagerness that Cortez bore with tolerant patience. In the evenings they sat by the fire and she sewed or read, and he worked on plans for the spring, and they talked about everything and nothing, and sometimes they simply sat in companionable quiet with the fire and Hector between their feet. And Abigail thought that this was the specific thing she had not known. She was looking for this particular texture of shared daily life with a person who was entirely themselves and who made room for her to be entirely herself in return. Spring came, and with it news that she carried inside herself for a week before telling him, sitting with it privately, turning it over with the same careful attention she gave to things she wanted to understand completely before she spoke about them. She told him on a Sunday morning when they were sitting at the kitchen table after breakfast, with the spring sunlight coming through the window and Hector asleep in the doorway, and the particular unhurried peace of a weekend morning. She told him simply and directly, because that was how they told each other important things. He was very still for a moment when she said it, and then he reached across the table and took her hand with both of his and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something beyond happiness, something that had gone past ordinary gladness into a territory that had no convenient name but had everything to do with a future that was suddenly, concretely, irrevocably real. "Are you well?" he asked. "You feel well?" "I feel entirely well," she said. "Better than well." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she thought that she had never in her life felt so thoroughly arrived. Their son was born in November of 1879, exactly 1 year after their wedding, in the bedroom of the ranch house with the aid of Dr. Simmons, who rode out from Dusty Creek and was steady and capable, and Mrs. Calloway, who had come as a matter of course because she was that kind of woman when she chose to be. It was a long and hard labor, and Abigail was braver in it than she had expected herself to be, which was to say considerably brave, and Benjamin sat outside the bedroom door for 7 hours in a state of concentrated stillness that was his version of barely managing. When Dr. Simmons came out and told him he had a son and that Abigail was well, Benjamin's expression did something complicated and private that the doctor had the decency to look away from. They named him James, after Benjamin's father, with the middle name Thomas, not for Thomas Hartley, whom Abigail had never met and felt no obligation to, but for her own father, whose given name had also been Thomas. James Thomas Townsend came into the world with a significant quantity of dark hair, and an emphatic voice that he exercised with enthusiasm from the first moments of his life. And Abigail held him and looked at Benjamin over the top of the baby's head, and felt the particular dizzying joy of a life that had exceeded every expectation she had brought to it. James was a robust and sociable child who grew into the specific mischief of a boy raised on a working ranch with a father who included him in everything from the earliest possible age. By the time he was 2, he had attempted to befriend every animal on the property, with results that were mixed but rarely genuinely dangerous. By 3, he was following Benjamin on short rounds of the fence line, riding in front of his father on the horse with the particular regal satisfaction of a small person in an important position. Hector, aging now but still devoted, followed at the horse's heels and regarded the child with the tolerant affection of a dog who has decided to expand his responsibilities. Dusty Creek grew around them. New families came, a new general store opened, the schoolhouse was expanded with a second room that Miss Bean was intensely pleased about. A small doctor's office was established, which meant Dr. Simmons no longer had to operate out of his house. The railroad came through 30 miles north, which was far enough not to disrupt the town's character, but close enough to affect trade and make the movement of cattle easier and more profitable. Benjamin's herd grew steadily toward the 500 head that had been his long-horizon goal when he had first broken the ground on the northeastern pasture fence. Abigail continued at the schoolhouse until James was born, and then stepped back to a single day a week so that Miss Bean could plan around her, but the work could continue in some form, because she was not someone who could entirely let go of something she cared about, and a weekly day at the school was her compromise between the pull of her child and the pull of her work. She had also, by 1881, taken on the informal role of bookkeeper for 3 other businesses in Dusty Creek: the general store, the livery stable, and a small dry goods operation run by a woman named Martha Chen, who had arrived from San Francisco with her husband the previous year, and was building something of her own with a determination that Abigail recognized and admired. There was a quality that Dusty Creek had begun to acquire in these years, that she found herself paying attention to the specific texture of a place that was becoming something, accumulating the layers of human effort and connection that turned a settlement into a community. The injustices of the frontier were not invisible to her. She saw them daily in the way people like Martha Chen and her husband navigated attitudes that had nothing to do with their character or their contributions, and in the legacy of men like Tom Henderson, who had lost land through manipulation that the law had been poorly equipped to address. These things were real, and she did not look away from them. She talked about them with Benjamin, who was not a man who pretended complications did not exist, and they disagreed sometimes about what could be done and sometimes about what should be done, and they worked through those disagreements with the earnest difficulty of 2 people who respected each other enough to take the other's argument seriously. It was one of the things she loved most about their marriage, that it was not a performance of agreement but an actual ongoing negotiation between 2 real people with their own particular ways of seeing, and that the negotiation was never so hard that it wore them down, and never so easy that it stopped being honest. Their second child, a daughter named Clara, arrived in the spring of 1882. Clara was born with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubbornness in approximately equal measure, and showed a very early interest in animals that placed her in daily dramatic negotiation with the ranch's various inhabitants, which she invariably won. She was speaking in full sentences at an age that made Dr. Simmons raise his eyebrows, and had opinions about everything from which of the horses was nicest to the proper way to arrange the flowers in the front garden bed, which she had claimed as her own territory from the time she was large enough to hold a small trowel. James, 3 years older, accepted her arrival with the resigned pragmatism of a firstborn, and within 6 months had become her most devoted protector, a role he took seriously and executed with the particular gravity of a 4-year-old, who has decided that gravity is appropriate to the situation. The summer of 1883 was when Abigail looked up from the life she had been building, piece by careful piece for 5 years, and saw it whole. She was standing in the kitchen of the ranch house on a July morning, which had been added to and expanded twice since the original structure, so that it now had a proper kitchen with a large table and a room for each of the children, and a study that she and Benjamin shared where the Ledgers lived, and where she spent certain evenings with her accounts while he read or worked on plans beside her. She was standing at the window above the sink, watching Benjamin in the far pasture with James on the horse before him, the two of them moving along the fence line in the early morning light with Hector trotting behind, and Clara was still asleep upstairs, and the smell of coffee and breakfast was in the air, and through the open back door the Texas morning was coming in clean and warm. She stood at that window and felt the specific, full-bodied quality of a life that had grown into exactly what it was supposed to be, through no design she had consciously executed, but through 1,000 individual choices: getting off the stagecoach, asking for work, drinking coffee at Vera's diner, saying yes and yes and yes to the things that mattered. She had not planned Benjamin Townsend. She had not planned any of this. She had planned Thomas Hartley and a specific kind of future, and that had dissolved before she arrived, and what had grown in its place was beyond anything she would have had the imagination to plan. That evening she told Benjamin about standing at the window and what she had felt. They were on the porch after the children were asleep, the way they spent many evenings, the same porch where they had sat in the early days of whatever they had been becoming to each other, and later where he had kissed her for the first time, and later still where he had walked up to ask for her properly before proposing. The stars were out in the full Texas extravagance. "I stood at the window this morning," she said, "and I thought that I am the most fortunate person I have ever known." He turned to look at her. "Why this morning particularly?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Sometimes things come into focus all at once. I just saw it all very clearly." He was quiet for a moment in the comfortable way, looking out at the dark pasture where the cattle were settled and still. "I think about the day you stepped off that stagecoach," he said. "I've thought about it a great deal over the years. I almost didn't offer to carry your trunk. I almost just walked by." "What stopped you?" "You looked like someone who was managing something very difficult and doing it without asking for help," he said. "And I respected that. But the trunk looked genuinely heavy." She laughed. "That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard." "The trunk was very heavy," he said, with that slight self-deprecating quality she had always loved. She took his hand. "I'm glad you didn't walk by," she said. "So am I," he said, and brought her hand to his lips. "Every day, Abigail, every single day." In 1884, a third child arrived, another son whom they named Robert. Robert was a quieter child than either James or Clara, thoughtful and observant, the kind of boy who sat at the edge of activity and watched it all with large, serious eyes before deciding whether to participate. He had Benjamin's coloring and Abigail's habit of precision, and he spoke less than his siblings, but when he spoke, it tended to be something worth hearing, which had been said of his father and was clearly hereditary. James, by now 9 years old, had developed an authoritative expertise in cattle that Benjamin regarded with the particular satisfaction of a man watching something he has built reach toward the next generation. He could already identify the condition of an animal from 20 yards and had opinions about the herd management that were, on examination, frequently correct. Abigail watched her son becoming a rancher the way she watched her daughter becoming a naturalist and her youngest son becoming a philosopher, and thought that the particular pleasure of watching children grow into themselves was something she had not had the capacity to imagine before they existed. Miss Bean married in 1885, a schoolteacher from a neighboring town named Robert Aldrich, who came to give a talk at the Dusty Creek School about mathematics and stayed because of a leaner Bean. And the wedding was a town celebration that Abigail attended with enormous happiness on behalf of her friend, who had given her more in the years since her arrival than she could comfortably quantify. In 1886, Benjamin expanded the ranch to 680 head, which was the largest operation in the immediate county, and hired 2 more permanent hands, and began talking about bringing in a proper foreman so that he could step back slightly from the daily physical management. He was 37 now, and the years of hard physical work had begun to register in the way they do for men who have spent their best years in the sun and wind, not in debilitation, but in the particular seasoning of a person shaped by their work. He was more beautiful to Abigail at 37 than he had been at 29, because she now knew everything behind the face, all the specific ways he was complicated and sensible and stubborn and gentle, and the way he loved their children with a warmth that he expressed mostly through action rather than declaration, and the way he still turned to look at her across a room with that particular directness of feeling that had not diminished in 8 years of daily proximity. She told him this one evening when they were alone in the study going over the quarterly accounts, a tradition of their marriage that she had never given up, the two of them at the shared desk with the ledgers between them, because it had been how they came to know each other, and it remained in some sense their particular ritual. "I think you're better now than you were," she said, looking up from the column she had been checking. He looked up. "What?" "When I first saw you," she said. "You were very handsome in a straightforward way, but you're better now." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had first seen at the hotel dinner on the Friday evening before he told her he was falling in love with her, and which had not changed its essential nature in 8 years. "You can't say things like that," he said, "when we're doing accounts." "Why not?" "Because," he said, closing the ledger with gentle deliberateness, "the accounts will have to wait." She laughed, and he came around the desk and kissed her with the same quality of unhurried certainty that he had brought to it the very first time, and the ledger waited quite a considerable time before they returned to it. The years moved in the way that good years move, which is to say they moved too quickly in the remembering but felt full and spacious in the living. James turned 16 in 1895, and was by then effectively Benjamin's partner in the ranch operations. A tall, serious young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's quick intelligence, who had the particular quality of being someone that other people trusted instinctively. Clara, at 13, was a force of nature in the best possible sense. She had appointed herself the authority on the flower garden, the vegetable garden, the chicken yard, and the comfort of any animal within her jurisdiction, and was currently in the process of teaching Robert's dog a series of tricks that the dog performed with great enthusiasm, if irregular accuracy. Robert at 10 was reading above his age by several years, and had developed a correspondence with a professor in Austin, who had heard about the boy's mathematical abilities through some connection Abigail was still not entirely clear on. Dusty Creek had grown. There were new streets and new buildings and a proper hotel that was actually good and a second school. There was a newspaper. There was a doctor who was not Dr. Simmons, who had retired, but a young woman named Dr. Margaret Hale who had trained in Boston and arrived in 1893 to the mixed reception of a town deciding what it thought about a female physician, and who had distinguished herself in the first 3 months by handling a difficult medical situation involving a ranch accident with a competence so undeniable that the debate had simply ended. Abigail liked Dr. Hale enormously. She had found over the years that she was drawn to women who were doing something difficult without making a performance of the difficulty. And Dr. Hale did this with the same focused practicality that Abigail recognized from her own experience of simply getting on with what needed to be done regardless of whether the world had prepared a convenient path for you. In the spring of 1896, on the 18th anniversary of Abigail's arrival in Dusty Creek, Benjamin came in from the morning's work and found her in the kitchen garden, on her knees in the dirt with her gardening gloves on, doing something thoughtful to the base of a rose bush that had been struggling. He stood at the garden gate and watched her for a moment. The way the morning light fell on her hair, which had threads of silver in it now, but was still predominantly the warm auburn he had noticed the day she got off the stagecoach, the competent, economical way she moved, the characteristic forward set of her head that meant she was concentrating. "Abigail," he said. She looked up. "Do you know what today is?" She sat back on her heels and thought about it, and then she smiled. Not the polite smile she gave strangers and acquaintances, but the particular full smile that was his, that she kept for moments when something moved her genuinely. 18 years, she said. 18 years, he confirmed. He came through the gate and crouched down beside her in the garden dirt, which he did without any ceremony or apparent concern for his trousers, and looked at her at close range with the directness of feeling that was simply how he looked at her. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "The day you got off that stagecoach," he said, "I didn't know what was happening to me. I just knew I wanted to know you. And everything that's come since then, the children, this place, the life, it's more than I ever thought I'd have. And none of it would be what it is without you." She put her gloved hand against his face, leaving a small smudge of garden soil on his cheek, which he did not mind. "I came here with nothing," she said. "Less than nothing. I came here with the ruins of a plan, and you were standing there and you said the trunk looked heavy and you were right and everything else followed from that." She looked at him steadily. "You gave me the life I didn't know I was looking for. You built it," he said. "You built it yourself. I was just there." "You were exactly there," she said. "That's the whole thing." He kissed her in the garden in the spring morning with the smell of earth and rose and Texas air around them, and she kissed him back with the full comfort of 18 years of choosing each other. And it was different from the first time and better, not less urgent but more certain, grounded in the accumulated weight of everything they had lived together. James finished his formal education in Dusty Creek and took on the official role of ranch manager at 22, which freed Benjamin in a way he hadn't realized he needed until it happened. He began to take Saturdays for himself, which meant taking Saturdays for Abigail, long rides out through the county that they had not taken together since before the children were small, or simply sitting on the porch, without an account to go over or a problem to solve, just the two of them and the view. Clara, at 20, had begun an apprenticeship with Dr. Hale that surprised everyone except Abigail, who had seen it coming in Clara's particular quality of attention to living things since she was old enough to hold a small trowel over a struggling plant. Dr. Hale declared her the most intuitive student she had ever encountered, which was the kind of praise that made Clara lift her chin in the specific way that was pure Benjamin and make Abigail feel a wordless completeness. Robert, at 18, had a confirmed place at the University of Texas in Austin beginning that fall studying mathematics, which the professor he had been corresponding with for 8 years had worked considerable effort to secure. He was quiet about it in the way he was quiet about most things, but on the evening the letter came he had sat with his parents at the kitchen table with an expression of such complete happiness that Abigail had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much, and Benjamin had clapped his youngest son on the shoulder with a pride that manifested physically, because he had never entirely learned to say it differently. On the last night before Robert left for Austin, the whole family sat at the long kitchen table, the table that had been extended twice over the years as the family grew, and the community of their daily life expanded, and ate dinner together with a deliberate attention to the specific fact of being gathered, because they all knew it was a passage. James was there with the quiet authority he wore so naturally now. Clara was there with her characteristic forward energy, asking Robert approximately 75 questions about Austin that she was probably not going to let him answer before asking the next one. Benjamin sat at the head of the table with the expression of a man taking inventory of a life and finding it beyond anything he had expected. Abigail sat at the other end and watched all of them and thought, this is it. This is what it was for, this whole specific thing. After the children were in their rooms and the table was cleared, She and Benjamin sat on the porch in the warm fall evening, the same porch, the same 2 chairs, the same view of the pasture dark under the stars, and he reached over and took her hand without comment, and she held his. "Are you all right?" she asked. "More than all right," he said. "He'll be fine," she said. "I know he will," he said. "He's his mother's son." "He's yours too," she said. "He is," he agreed. "But the part that will be fine in Austin is yours." She leaned her head on his shoulder in the dark and felt the particular piece of a thing fully built and well-made and inhabited with love. "I stepped off that stagecoach with $11.40, she said. "I know," he said, because she had told him this years ago and he had not forgotten. "I've thought about that woman a great deal over the years," she said. "The one standing in the street with the trunk. What do you think about her?" he asked. "I think she was braver than she knew," Abigail said, "and I think she was luckier than she knew. And I think the two things are related, that the bravery made space for the luck." He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said, "that she walked into the right street at exactly the right moment, and that I had enough sense to notice." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him in the starlight, this man who had carried her trunk and bought her coffee and listened and been present and built a life beside her with his own hands, who had given her the kind of love that was not a story but a daily fact, patient and solid and real. "I love you," she said. 20 years of knowing you, and I still want you to know that." "I know it," he said. "I've always known it. But I want you to know it too." He looked at her with those dark eyes and that expression that had not changed since the hotel dining room by candlelight in 1878, except that now it had 20 years of history behind it, and the history made it more rather than less. "I love you, Abigail Townsend. I loved you when you were too sensible to fall in love at that particular moment, and I loved you when you weren't, and I'll love you when the pasture out there is grass again, and we're old enough that this porch is the most we can manage." She laughed and leaned forward and kissed him softly and thoroughly, and the stars were extraordinary overhead, and somewhere in the pasture the cattle were settled and quiet, and the house behind them held their children sleeping, and the future was not the one she had imagined when she packed her trunk in Ohio and said her goodbyes and bought her stagecoach ticket for a town in Texas she had never seen. It was better. Immeasurably, specifically, completely better. And Abigail Prescott Townsend, who had arrived in Dusty Creek with $11.40 and the ruins of a plan, sat on her porch in the warm Texas night with her husband's hand in hers, and thought that she would not trade a single moment of any of it, not the fear, not the uncertainty, not the heavy trunk on the hot street on that first May afternoon, because every single moment had been necessary to arrive precisely here. The crickets sang in the grass beyond the porch. The stars burned above the pasture. The house was full of sleeping children and the history of a life well lived. Benjamin Townsend and Abigail Townsend sat together in the dark, as they had been sitting together for 20 years, in the best possible version of everything they had built, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was exactly right.